anymore. So, okay. So again, my name is Butch Farabee. I'm a board member of the Old Pueblo Archaeology Center, and welcome to all of you to the third Thursday for Food Thought program. And in a moment, I'm going to introduce our speaker, which will be a real pleasure for me. But first I have to say, this program is presented by Old Pueblo Archaeology Center of Tucson, Arizona, as part of Old Pueblo's third Thursday Food for Thought presentation series. Old Pueblo Archaeology Center respectfully acknowledges that our nonprofit organization occupies and conducts our activities on land and territories of indigenous peoples. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the O'odham and the Yaqui. Committed to diversity and inclusion, Old Pueblo strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign Native nations and indigenous communities through education offerings, partnerships, and community service. So having said that, I'm going to introduce Lynda Sánchez. And very briefly, we'll let you know that Lynda is a Peace Corps volunteer from Colombia, learned to speak Spanish down there, and did her field archaeological work in Mesa Verde as well as in Belize. She has taught Spanish and Spanish and Southwest history and anthropology at the high school and college levels, and believes history and archaeology should go hand in glove. She's a past president of the Lincoln County, New Mexico Historical Society, and has received numerous awards related to writing of history and her historic preservation work, including a cavalry sword for her work preserving historic Fort Stanton in New Mexico, and a True West magazine's 2007 Best Preservation Project in the Nation Award. The Historical Society of New Mexico honored her in 2008 with this prestigious L. Bradford Prince Preservation Award. She's a member of the Western Writers of America, and she's written over 400 articles on the Southwest and Mexico, including for Arizona Highways, New Mexico Magazine, True West, and El Palacio. She's co-authored the book Inde and wrote the books Apache Legends and Lore of Southern New Mexico, as well as Eve Ball, Woman Among Men, featuring the remarkable woman she plans to tell us about tonight. She's a historian of the American West and an educator well known for her oral history research and books on Apache Indians. And I've been in contact with her over the years in relation to her research. I keep egging her on to try to complete a particular book that I find very interesting. So this is being recorded, and I will monitor the chat and question, the hand-raising thing at the bottom of your screen. And I believe Lynda has agreed to answer some questions, and we will present the questions, if it's okay with Lynda, at the end of the program. So Lynda, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's program, and thank you very much for doing this for us. Now I'm going to shut up.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I think I'll hire you as my agent. That would be really a kind of a special thing. And of course, I also want to thank Al Dart. You guys do a terrific job, and if I were in front of the audience right now, I would ask everyone to give you a rousing hand of approval and thank you. This evening, I'm supposed to talk about Apache warriors telling their side of things. And we have to go back a little bit in time to whenever I was growing up in Arizona. I am a native of Arizona, and I grew up close to the Desert Museum, your famous Arizona Sonora Desert Museum. I lived there for the first 12 years of my life. And I remember my dad, who at that time was the superintendent of Tucson Mountain Park, he would take me with him in his pickup to visit the camps of we used to call them Papagos, but now they're called, their original name, Tohono O'odham. And every chance I had, I went with him to visit the camp leaders whenever they would come up from their homes in the south to gather the cactus fruit, the saguaro fruit. And so from that time on, I've always been interested in Native American history. It's amazing what your parents, how they can influence you. And that's another reason why I think that the Old Pueblo Archaeology Center is so wonderful, because you do a lot of that outreach. And believe me, as a former educator, we need to have outreach to our young people for sure. Eve Ball was perhaps the most remarkable woman I've ever known. She was independent, she was tough, she was my mentor, and she was like a grandmother to me. We met at a historical society meeting here in Lincoln, New Mexico, where I live now. And I recall this feisty little old lady sitting in the back. And of course, I didn't know who she was, and I saw her sitting there, and then I went over and sat with her. And as the program began, she was actually the guest speaker. And I found out later that she needed somebody to work with her because she was losing her vision and she needed some help. And I thought, wow, this is an opportunity to work with this incredible lady who's written all this material. And that's how we got started. Another thing she started the program with that night is what I'm going to start with right now in terms of the relationship that she developed with the Apaches. She walked up to the podium, and in her hand, she had what looked like a pretty fierce weapon. It was actually Ace Daklugie's War Club. And she looked out at the audience and she said, "This is an Apache War Club." And it belonged to Asa Daklugie, the son of Chief Ho and nephew of Geronimo. And of course, everybody was wondering, well, how did she get this war club? So she proceeded to tell the story. And when I hear the story, chills run up and down my spine, because it's the story of a young man who was maybe 15 or 16, and he had surrendered with the other Apaches in 1886. That evening, knowing that his freedom was going to be totally gone, he walked up a canyon, up a hillside, and there was a huge boulder. He stopped by the boulder, dug a hole, and ended up placing his war club at the base, covered it over, tamped it down, and then he walked down the hill and up down the canyon and into history, essentially. 27 years later, after he was a prisoner of war for that long, he came back to that same site, went up the hill, dug it up, and there it was still at the site. Only, of course, the rawhide had deteriorated, the candle had deteriorated, and it was in pieces. So he took it very carefully back with him to Mescalero, which was his new home, and he refurbished it. He put new leather on it, and he sewed it, a better handle and all of that. For those of you who have not seen an Apache War Club, they're pretty wicked weapons. It had a handle, and then there was kind of like a loop, and at the end of that loop, he had placed a rock, and the rock was encased with the buckskin. And boy, if they popped you with it like that, it hurt, I'll tell you. So that was the story that Eve started that program with. And I was just really thrilled, and I thought, wow, that poor young man to have gone through all of that. Eve Ball and Ace Daklugie, the relationship between those two is what allowed Eve to gather information from the Apaches. But how did it all start? Eve Ball grew up on a cattle ranch in Kansas, but she always wanted to write about Native Americans. And that's what she did. She studied, she was independent, she went to school. Now, she was born in 1890, so it was right during that Victorian era. And in 1890, people were pretty, I guess, closed-minded, but Eve was always very independent, and she decided that she was going to study Native American history, and she wanted to move somewhere where there were actually Apaches. And so what she did is she ended up with a master's degree in English, which was a great accomplishment for a woman in that era. She moved to the oil fields of Texas because her two brothers were there earning a living. So she ended up in some pretty rough oil boom towns. And from there, she moved eventually to Ruidoso, New Mexico, because it was close to the Mescalero Reservation. And the Mescalero Reservation, they're the ones that opened their arms to the Chiricahua prisoners of war who came from Fort Sill, Oklahoma in 1913. But before that, you know, they were there for 27 years, including the old warriors that she was to eventually know and interview. They were 15, 16, 17 years old when they surrendered, and they were still living when she was actually living at Ruidoso and discussing their history, listening to them. In addition to that, she also was very much in tune with the other pioneers, the Anglo and the Hispanic pioneers, and she even knew some of those men that rode the outlaw trail during the Lincoln County War and during other outlaw type events during the early 1900s. So Eve got acquainted with so many different people, but her life's work, her real life's work happened to be the Apaches. She had a group of Hispanics build her a home on the outskirts of Ruidoso where she had bought some property. They built her this adobe house. It was very simple, but it was strong and sturdy. And as she began to move in, she noticed that the Apache women would walk from the reservation into Ruidoso to buy supplies. Now that's a heck of a long way. That's at least 10 miles for most of them. And she would notice them trudging past her house, and on occasion they would stop and they would ask her for a drink of water, if they could have a drink of water from her hose. And she said, well, sure, by all means. After about a week or two of this was in the early 40s, she put a table and chairs out there for them, and a bunch of glasses and a lemonade and a jug of water. And so the word spread that there was this old white lady living up on the hill that provided a drink of water for them, and she was very kind and nice. So they began to stop there almost every time they went into town, and she put up chairs and they would sit down and she would go out and she'd talk to them, and it was very interesting. She began to learn about the Daklugies and the Chihuahuas, the Ishtes, Coacla's relatives, Kaitini, many of the people that had moved to Mescalero, and most of those, of course, were the Chiricahua prisoners of war. She also learned and met other of the Mescaleros, and she learned a lot about them too, but they were not prisoners of war. This was their reservation. So the ones that she was talking to were mainly Chiricahua. There were a few Lipan. And as with many cases, mostly the women are the conduit to the men. And once she found out who their uncles or grandparents or their husbands were, she asked them if they thought that she could talk to them about what it was like as a warrior during their years of freedom, what it was like in Oklahoma and Florida and that kind of thing. And she was met with kind of stares like, well, I don't know, maybe. And eventually they brought their fathers, their brothers, to meet this woman. And after many years, she built up the confidence and the trust among the people, because you can't learn a person's side of things until you really get to know them and until they trust you. The one that she was really interested in getting to know was Ace Daklugie. Ace was well educated. He was one of the men that had gone to Carlisle, but he was a very rebellious young man, and she was always very concerned about getting his approval because he was a known leader of the tribe. Now, his father was Chief Ho, or Hu, depending on how you want to pronounce it, and he was a Nedni that lived in Mexico for the most part, although of course he raided and came into this area. He was Daklugie's father, and he died young. So Daklugie had seen his father die, had seen his brothers and sisters captured, and just all kinds of things before he was even an apprentice warrior. And that's what happened with so many of the warriors after they came back to Mescalero. There were maybe 10 or 15 that had experienced similar atrocities and adventures and fighting for what they considered was their homeland. Now, to try to get Daklugie to talk, she had to get to his wife, Ramona Chihuahua Daklugie. And she and Ramona eventually became very good friends, but she still didn't have any luck getting Daklugie to visit with her. However, after 4 years, just imagine 4 years trying to get information from someone, he agreed to talk to her. And so he would come to her home every week. This was what, now remember, he was like 80, 85 during all this getting acquainted process. He did everything by the book. He was very formal, and he was also very brisk, and he would make statements like, well, my father was a good man. He killed lots of white eyes. And Eve just listened. The main thing about Eve is she listened while the Apaches spoke. She didn't try to speak over them. And it's something that Eve did with all of her interviewers. She listened, and oral history at that time was not, the academics really poo-pooed it and said, well, it's not really that important. Who can believe a bunch of old people? However, oral history was part of the tradition of all Native American groups, and the Apaches were no exception. They were trained from the beginning because they had no written language. And in order to succeed, they had to get the message from one point to another point. If they were fighting, if they were trying to get information or help out to different families, whatever, the people listening had to repeat things verbatim. And so Eve found that when she interviewed these people, that the story was almost verbatim every time. In other words, they didn't change things, they didn't exaggerate, they just said the same basic story, unless she asked a question. Now, she didn't ask questions very often because she didn't want to interrupt their train of thought. The train of thought is very important in oral history, and as an oral historian, you need to know how to guide them, but not interrupt them. It's pretty amazing what she got from so many of these people. And once Daklugie agreed to visit with her, it was like a floodgate of cooperation. And people would come to her home. They would trust her like kind of with their documents and their photographs. In fact, one time a fellow came by and he had this really heavy box, and he asked her if she would keep the box for him for, I don't know, a couple of months. And she said, well, are you sure you want it to leave it here this long? And he said, yes. So whenever she reached for it, it was heavy. It was very heavy. She did not ask what it was, but she told me later that she figured it was probably gold ingots. It was about the time that the Victoria Peak excavation by the military, if you believe that story, that the military went into Victoria Peak and took all the gold out. And there was always the legend of Victoria's gold. Or maybe he got the ingots from some other place, but she pretty much figured it had to be gold to be that heavy. He came back a couple of months later and she returned it to him, and that was it. Now, others that talked to her, Eugene Chihuahua, who is the son of Chief Chihuahua. We had Alberta Begay, who was Maasai's daughter. In fact, Alberta and all of these people, actually the stories of these people are in this book, Lynda and Apache Odyssey. I don't know how well you can see it, but it's Lynda and Apache Odyssey, and I'm a co-author of the book. Many of the stories that she got over many, many years are in this book. And Alberta was one of them, and she described how the ranchers over near Winston and Chloride killed her father. And that's pretty tough for a young girl. And I think she was very young, maybe 5 or 6. And the brothers and sisters were with Alberta's mom and Maasai. Maasai was the only one that really escaped from the train that took the Apaches away from the Southwest. That happened in 1886. And he was bound and determined not to go as a prisoner. So he jumped the train, probably somewhere in the Midwest, and made his way back to the Southwest. He also stole some women, and this one, Alberta's mother, was one of them. However, he treated them really nice. He just was lonesome, you know, he wanted company. And they had several children. The story of Maasai's death is pretty gruesome. They shot him and they burned his body. They decapitated him. And all of this they found out after the men went back to their homes. Alberta also said that they had burned the body, and you know, this is their side of the story. Some people say that Maasai was really the Apache Kid. Well, no, that's not true, because there are 2 men. One was the Apache Kid who was a scout in Arizona, and then there was Maasai, the one who escaped the train. Both of them were pretty tough warriors, but Alberta described how they came back to the campfire and took the bones and gathered them up and whatever else they could find, and they took them off to a special place and buried the bones, said their prayers so that he could properly enter the land of Usen, and Usen was the name for their god. They also found a small belt buckle, and that belt buckle was the only object that they had left of Maasai. Alberta showed the buckle to Eve and eventually gave it to her for safekeeping. In fact, Eve had lots of really interesting things in her files. And when I began to work for her and to become her assistant, And then, you know, we drove all over the place together, had a great time. I drove a 1977 International Scout. It had dual mufflers, and she loved it. She was fascinated, and she loved to go places in that Scout. And she even offered to pay a couple of my tickets because she called me Leadfoot Lynda. And I have been known as Leadfoot Lynda for a long time. And we got caught by cops a couple of times over in Tularosa and Alamogordo, and I took her many places, and she was just like a walking encyclopedia. She'd say, well, over here we have this, and the mountains over there, that's where Daklugie and Chihuahua hunted, and those kinds of things. So I learned a lot about the area that I would have never learned in any other way. But anyway, Alberta gave her the belt buckle. And then one day I was working, and I was looking in, she had many files in the back of her office. And I was looking under the Y segment of the file. And I noticed off to the side, there was an envelope. And on it, it was written, Yanosha's bullets. And I took the envelope out and I said, Eve, what is this? What is the story about Yanosha's bullets, or cartridges is what they really were? But she said, well, he's one of the ones that I interviewed in the early 50s. And Yanosha was Geronimo's brother-in-law. And of course, he definitely had his side of things too, his stories. He was 22 when captured, and he was known as a sharpshooter. He usually was, I guess, what we would call a sniper today, and he never wasted a bullet. She often would go to the reservation and visit their home. She was welcome in most of their homes. I don't know of anyone that hadn't invited her to come see them. And Yanosha did not speak English, so Winona Magush was the one who helped translate for her. One afternoon, Yanosha got up. Let's see, this must have been about like 1950s, 52, something like that. And he went to the back of the house, and he came back with 3 cartridges. And he gave them to her, and he said, I want you to have these. These are 3 cartridges that I kept with me during that whole time of incarceration at Fort Sill and in Alabama and also in Florida. I kept these through that whole time. And now I want you to keep them. And of course, here they are. It's, I don't know if you can you see them at all? Yes, no?
Yes.
Okay, there are 3 of them, live ammo. I'd sure hate to be hit by one of these slugs. Going through Eve's files, it was like you needed, maybe you should conduct an archaeological dig in her files, because she was just absolutely amazing in terms of what she, there's a message here. Okay. Anyway, it was like finding all kinds of incredible objects, and she had those cartridges in the one file probably since he gave them to her in the 50s. I've had them in my files since 1982. And so the chain of command, or the chain of possession, is pretty solid there. Yanosha was also a very interesting character, and he told her a little bit about when he was a guide for Dr. Helge Ingstad, whenever Ingstad went into the Sierra Madre in the mid-30s looking for any remnant Apaches. Yanosha at that time was about 70 years old. So just imagine you as being 70 or around in that age, taking a Norwegian professor into the mountains where you used to roam as a free warrior. And it was like Helge Ingstad described Yanosha as, wow, it was like he was free at last, and he would tell them about this place over there, or this is where we attacked the cavalry when they came down the ravine or whatever. So Yanosha had a long life, and he had many experiences. He was a most unusual gentleman. And he was a gentleman staying with her. It was, okay. I see you're typing in information. I thought maybe you were making little messages for me to shut up and to keep on going.
No, go ahead. Ignore the chat.
Anyway, that's the story of Yanosha's Cartridges. Other times I found interesting reports. And Eve Ball was a researcher. She was an historian. And she said, if nothing else is said about me, I want people to know about my struggle to get these people's stories told, because at that time, oral history was not really accepted. And of course, I've explained to you why it's so important that these old Apaches, that they have their side told, because they had wonderful memories. Another old timer was Old Scout Big Mouth. Now, Big Mouth was not a prisoner of war. He was born at Mescalero. Or in the country before there was Mescalero, a reservation actually. And his story and many other folk tales are told in this book right here, Apache Legends. Can you see that? Apache Legends and Lore of Southern New Mexico. In this book, we have the tale of Old Scout Big Mouth, who scouted during the Geronimo campaign, and he was a tribal policeman for many years. But he also was at the Bosque Redondo. Now, the Bosque Redondo was another place of incarceration. It was where the military had 7,000 Navajos and 500 Apaches all crammed together there at Fort Sumner. It was a terrible experience for everybody. And one of the things that Eve found out, once she met Old Scout's son, Percy Big Mouth, she realized that maybe Percy would translate for her, because Old Scout did not speak English at all. So she got Percy to translate. And in that way, she began to get the story of the Mescalero side of things, and the story of what it was like at Bosque Redondo. This old warrior was maybe 8 or 10 whenever his people were made to walk to the Bosque. The one thing he talked about a lot was worms. This was a childhood memory of the Bosque. And he would talk about worms, and we were wondering, what does he mean by worms? He said there were worms everywhere. And whenever he spoke, he spoke very softly and passionately about the time there. And apparently, I checked it out a little bit, and one year there was a corn crop that was destroyed. And the corn crop was destroyed by these cutter worms, and they were all over the corn. So consequently, there was not much food that winter. So he remembered both the starvation part and the starvation part, as well as going for food, or going without food for a long time. And then there were the maggots and the worms that they saw in the bodies that the people the Pecos River went through their camp. And when smallpox or when other problems arose and people died or animals died, they threw them in the river, and the bodies floated down by their camp. And maggots, of course, are not the most pleasant things to look at. And that's what he also remembered. And I think that combination of the worm story was pretty dramatic for a young man. After a couple of years, the Apaches decided they were going to leave And this is one thing that they were very clever about. They didn't let anybody know. They left a few old women to man the fires. It was in November when they decided they were going back to Sierra Blanca, the sacred mountain. They were getting the heck out of that awful place, and they left. They walked back and they disappeared into the mountains until the military eventually closed the concentration camp down, the prison, and then the Navajos were allowed to go back to their homeland as well. So these are the kinds of stories that Eve would get. She also cross-referenced. Any good researcher will do that. But whenever you're talking to someone, you don't start questioning the veracity of their story, you just listen. She took their information in shorthand rather than by tape recorder. A tape recorder is very intimidating. Even today, people don't like to be recorded. And in those days, tape recorders were like this, so it just didn't work. And she very quietly developed her own form of shorthand, and she developed a combination of shorthand that she learned in school and her own for words like mescalero or Daklugie or Old Scout and those kinds of things. Another really interesting character that she met at Mescalero was perhaps Geronimo's youngest warrior. His name was Jasper Cancia, and he was only 14 when they surrendered. Now, just remember back to your time when you were 14, 15, or 16. You still remember a lot of what went on. So he was a really good source of information. Yeah, Jasper was Yanosha's, the band I told you about before, who gave her the cartridges. Jasper was Yanosha's orderly or his horse holder. And I guess Jasper would come by many times just to sit and talk with Eve. And he would always come by with his wife. These old men, they never came separately because that wasn't proper. I thought it was kind of quaint, and I guess we would all think it's kind of quaint today, but they either had a grandchild or a wife or a daughter accompany them to visit the old white lady with many stories. Now, Eve was always very prim and proper. I never saw her in a pair of pants. She always had a dress on or a skirt and blouse. But he came by one day and he had this item. I hope you can see it. I don't know how clear it is.
Hold it back just a little bit, Lynda.
Pardon?
Hold it back just a little bit.
A little bit more like this?
Yeah, a little closer. There you go.
Okay. This looks kind of like a boomerang, but it really isn't. I'd be interested to see how many of you actually, by looking at it, might know what it is. You can write it down and just see if you guessed right. I'll give you 10 more seconds to do that. It's made out of a very hard wood. They cut it green and let it dry. But before it dried totally, they shaped it. And right in here, you can see a piece of metal. I hope you all can see that. And they placed this sharp piece of metal right in through here, and then it allowed it to dry. Once it was set in there very well, they used it as a hide scraper. In other words, they took a deer skin and put it over a log. The log, it just depended, the size was what the size the person wanted, but they put the deer hide over the log, and then they took the scraper and went this way and got all the hair off. It's a really nifty little tool. I think that when I first got it, there were still a lot of deer hair inserted here on both sides of where the metal was. Now I can see a few, but I've had it for 40 years, I guess. Anyway, he came by and he gave it to her. He said, "Mrs. Lady, I know you like stuff like this, and I would like you to have the hide scraper." And he explained how they processed it and how he had used it many times in his youth. He no longer used it. They use the metal hide scrapers, which I guess work much better. But anyway, Eve handed it to me and she said, "Well, I want you to have it now." So, you know, I feel very fortunate in that. Jasper Cansea was a policeman at Mescalero for many years. And over the years, his family grew, and he usually didn't like to talk about being a warrior until they felt more confidence and trust in Eve. They were hesitant to speak about some of those war days. Chief Naichi said that, yes, we killed a lot of people, but it was war and we had to. And so Eve never questioned that. She understood what they were referring to. Now, another item, which I think is also, there's just all kinds of stuff that I said it should be an archaeological dig in her study. But this is part of a sword, a saber, the bottom part. The handle broke off, but the saber, the blade is still inside. And believe me, this is sharp. I don't know who gave this to Eve, but it was one of the Apaches that came by our house, and he told her in kind of a mocking way. He said, "Well, this soldier didn't make it out of a battle he had with us." And it was found by this man at a site maybe, I don't know, several hundred yards from where Eve had her home. And it was one of those interesting artifacts that he had picked up, and over many years she had kept it in one of her bookshelves until I came along and I asked her, I said, "Well, what's the story on that?" So she was always full of stories, and she recorded the stories and the accounts. Many times they were mainly the men that came and talked about war and battles and things like that. The women would come and they would visit. They would talk about gathering, say something like chuchupate. I don't know if you know what osha is. It's a special herb that both Hispanics and the Apaches use, especially around here. The Mexican people call it chuchupate, and it is osha. That's what the Apaches used it for. It was for any kind of congestion, flu, fever, things like that. So that's what they would visit with her about. And one day, Eve was a gardener, and she had all kinds of flowers, and she happened to have what is called tansy. Now tansy, I'm trying to think of the other name. There's a name for it that you would probably be more familiar with, but it grows wild, and it also makes a really nice garden flower. And some of these ladies that were going back and forth to Mescalero were sitting there at the table, and they were giggling. And so Eve went out to say hello to them like she always did. And she said, "Well, why are you laughing?" And they said, "Why, Miss Ball, we had no idea that you had this in your yard." And they said, "Well, that was used like as a form of birth control." And so Eve, they all laughed, and they went on with other things. But little incidents like that just grew and grew and grew. And she moved in to her home in the 1940s. And by the time she was 70, she was about 50 whenever she moved in. By the time she reached the age of 70, her files were just bursting with information, and she began to write. So she wrote several books within a 10-year time frame. Lynda, an Apache Odyssey, the one that I helped co-author, was her primary work, but she also wrote In the Days of Victorio and Mam Jones of the Pecos, Bob Crosby, Champion. And then she wrote many, many articles about the Mexican Revolution and all kinds of adventure stories that got, she won many awards, but it wasn't the awards that she felt was the most important. The most important thing to her was the fact that those stories that people gave her, those accounts, were in print form. In explaining to people what she was doing, she said, just look at me as a saddle maker. You bring me the leather and the wooden tree, the stirrups, all of those things. And as the saddle maker, I put them all together into this beautiful saddle that tells the story of, you know, a person owning it. So look at me and what we're doing here as making a saddle. And that's what I'm doing with this book that I want to write about the Apache people. You bring me your stories, your documents, and your life desires, your hopes, your prayers, and we will put them into a book that will tell the story from your side of the fence. And, you know, she interviewed so many of these people. Another son of Victorio, let's see, Charles Ishte was Victorio's son. And he never wanted to be identified as Victorio's son because he was afraid. So Eve knew about the Ishte family, and his son, Evan, translated for her. And so actually Eve did interview Victorio's son on a couple of occasions, but he was just a baby, you know, whenever Victorio died in 1880. So he didn't remember very much. There were others who spoke about the days of Victorio. Coahuila was one. Now, Coahuila was pretty young. He was 4 or 5 whenever the massacre at Tres Castillos in Mexico happened. It was a terrible time for the Apache people. Victorio was an independent guy. He said, I'm not going to stay on the reservations. We're not going to do this. We're going to head for Mexico. And that's what they did. But at that time, the Mexicans were really on his trail because the devastation and the raids and the battle strategy. In fact, if you go to Embryo Canyon, I've been there 3 times. Embryo Canyon is an amazing place. And we walked out onto Victorio's rancheria. Talk about strategically located. I mean, you could tell the way he planned it and where the water was and where the horses were. He was also known to be an incredible military strategist. And some of the military men that Eve interviewed said that he was perhaps one of the greatest Native American generals, or what we would call a general, and his planning of war strategy. So that story is one that hasn't been told very well. Actually, there is a fellow in Great Britain by the name of Bob Watt, who wrote a 3-volume history of the Victorio campaigns. And anyone interested, you ought to check that out at the library. His name is Dr. Robert Watt. And he certainly covered the story of the Victorio campaign in real detail. We have another writer, his name is Vern Brand, and he lives in Tucson. He happens to be working on the biography of Chief Hu, or Chief Ho, who was Daklugie's father. And of course, Ho and Geronimo were brothers-in-law. So they were all interrelated, and they fought so hard because they had their families with them. But eventually, when you have 5,000 people chasing you, 5,000 cavalry from both sides of the border, and you only have 17 or 18 men left, along with a few women, you begin to wear down. And so the end of the Apache Wars occurred in 1886. And if you can imagine this 5'2" woman taking all this information down over many years, if she had not done that, we would not have these stories. And I don't like to really even say stories because it's their personal history. Daklugie said, well, just because it's written in a book doesn't mean it happened that way. And of course, Eve knew that was true. And they would spar. I think she sparred with him more than any of the others because he was so resentful of what had happened to his people, but he was also grateful and happy to be back in the Southwest. He had a sense of humor and also a sense of respect. I've already told you how he gave her the War Club. One day he also brought her a big old, well, as big as he could carry, spruce tree. It was a beautiful blue spruce. And he said, I'm bringing this to you as a gift. And he said, where would you like me to plant it? So they went outside and selected a site. And he planted it, dug the hole, and they planted it together. And I view that tree, and it's still living. It's drying up now, but it's still on the corner of the property that used to belong to Eve. And it's a symbol of the independence of Eve Ball and also the friendship of Daklugie and Eve. Another time, I don't know if you guys have a library there at your center. Do you have a library?
Yes, we do.
Aha. Well, one day they were talking, Ace and Eve were talking about white man's heaven versus Indian heaven. And the land of Yusun is the word for God. He said, you know, Apache heaven is really going to be much nicer than your white man's heaven. And she said, well, what do you mean? Well, we have beautiful mountains and streams, we have animals, we have fresh air, everything is beautiful. It's not noisy, not polluted. And you need to come to Apache heaven when you pass. And she said, well, I'm sure your heaven would be just really wonderful, and I would like it very much. But Ace, I also like to read and I love books. And they have libraries in white man's heaven, but not in your heaven. And he laughed and he said, why, Miss Ball, there's no problem. We'll just get up a war party and head over for that library, and we'll make a raid on the library and bring you any book you want, as many books as you want, and whenever you want. And so what else could she say but laugh and say, well, I believe you would do that. So it was the relationships that you build up over many, many years. Okay. Let me just check a couple of things here. That tree that I was telling you about, every time I drive by there, I feel so sad because it's drying up and nobody's taking care of it, and nobody has any idea of why it was there. I think what I would like to do now is show you one more thing and tell you something a little different. These are turkey feathers. There, can you see them?
Yes.
Now, you see the white markings on these turkey feathers? The Apaches used turkey feathers for many things. They used them for fletching, for arrows. They used them on their war caps as decoration, on their shields, and just, as a form of decoration, especially. In the book, Apache Legends and Lore, there's a wonderful story about how old brown turkey got these markings, these white markings. It's a story common to all Apache groups, but each one has variations. It's a story that Percy Big Mouth wrote down on Big Chief tablets. Are you familiar with what a Big Chief tablet looked like? I think some of us are familiar, and maybe some of us are pretty old, but those Big Chief tablets were amazing. And Percy Big Mouth had these tablets in his home. Now, he took care of his father, Old Scout Big Mouth, until the old man passed away. Scout Big Mouth was about 108 when he died, and that was in 1958. Percy died just a year later, which is so sad because he was only maybe 60 years old at that time. In the wintertime is when you gather around the fire and you tell stories. And most tribal people do. They do the storytelling in the winter. Now, Percy, in the wintertime, when he was trying to take care of his father, wrote on these Big Chief tablets story after story that he had remembered his parents telling him, or stories that he had heard from other people. Legends, the legend of creation, the cradleboard ceremony, other interesting tales of the coyote tales, the ant people, just a marvelous stories. And he wrote them out on many, many of these tablets. But he was also very disappointed in his own people because the younger people, now this is going to sound familiar, the younger people, they don't appreciate the past. And this is, as an educator, you know, this is one thing that really bugs me, that they don't appreciate history as much as they should. He said, too much of a white people's way, but I kept it in my sleeves, and I am going to write these stories, and I hope that one day they will be published. And he wrote this in a letter to his friend, Jean Harris. Jean came with her family every year to Redondo. They visited, they looked at things, and she rode horseback. She was on the reservation and she met Percy. Well, this young lady and some other individuals just loved listening to Percy. They became friends, and over 10 years, she would come back every summer, and then she stopped coming because she got married to a Dr. Jackson in Tennessee. Now, Dr. Jackson was interested, but you know, he had to make a living, and so she just never went back very often to Redondo. However, Percy got her address and began writing to her, and he one day sent all of these Big Chief tablets to her. And he said, please save these, do whatever you can, but I don't know what to do with them. It's very unusual for an Apache to write their own story. When I was teaching Apaches, I told them, write your stories, interview your grandparents, talk to your aunts and uncles, get their version, get their stories now before it's too late. Well, Percy did send them to this lady, and they kept them for many years. In 1982, I wrote an article about Eve for New Mexico Magazine about her work and how she got all these stories from the Apache warriors. About a month later, after it came out, I got a letter from the Dr. Jackson from Tennessee, and he explained who he was and that his wife had been friends with Percy Big Mouth, and he had all these tablets and he didn't know what to do with them, and would I be interested in maybe helping find a publisher. Well, Eve Ball and I were ready for another project, so we started on it, and of course Eve passed away in 1984, so we didn't really have much of a chance to continue with this material. It wasn't until 2014 that this book was published, and this has a lot of those tales that Percy had written down in his Big Chief tablets, as well as a general history of the Apaches and other folk tales. But Percy had the foresight to do that, thank heavens. Otherwise, we wouldn't have as much of his version of things. And his version, he was Lipan and Mescalero. But of course, growing up on the reservation, he also had many friends who were Chiricahua. One of my favorite stories in that book is the story of how Old Brown Turkey got his tail feathers painted white. It's a story of the flood. Almost every culture has a story of the flood. And this is the Apache version. Usen, their god, told them that there was going to be a big rain coming and that they needed to get all of their people and all of the animals that they felt were important to their lives, get them away from the lowlands, get them up on the mesa top, make brush arbors and wickiups and shelters for them, put animal skins over them, and decide which ones you're going to place where, and gather provisions and be prepared because it's going to rain for a very long time. The Apaches took about 8 years to get all of this done, and then it started to rain, and it rained and it rained. The mesa overlooked the Big Canyon, and that Big Canyon could have been probably the Copper Canyon of the Sierra Madre, or maybe Grand Canyon, nobody's really sure. The rains came and the water started to rise from the rivers below. The water churned and churned and the froth turned white. And all the animals that were sort of the lazy ones and they didn't want to get up on the mesa, they were kind of staying behind, and especially the old turkey hen and the old turkey gobbler. He came running finally. Eventually he realized his life was at stake. And so they started running and they tried to beat the water, but it kept churning and the froth kept getting thicker and thicker. In the meantime, the Apaches were watching from the top of the hill, and Apaches never admired weakness, and they were making fun of the old turkey, and they said, "Come on, get up here. Don't be so lazy, run." And he couldn't, he just couldn't. And he kind of waddled and struggled up on the bank, and the waters came over him, and a couple of Apaches felt sorry for him. They came down from the top of the mesa, picked him up, took him up to the mesa and laid him down, and his feathers eventually dried out. But the white from the foam, from the frothy foam, stayed and had dried on the turkey feathers. So that's how Old Brown Turkey got these markings. And that was the Mexican wild turkey and the brown turkeys that we have here in New Mexico. And I imagine you probably have them in Arizona as well. Every time I see a wild turkey, that's what I think about. And I think sometimes we dwell on the fact of the war part of the Apaches, but the Apaches had a wonderful culture. They had music, they sang, they danced, they had special ceremonies, the first haircut, the Apache cradle board ceremony. And if we had time, I would tell you about that. But what time is it now? It's about 8:13. Just so much information. And if it hadn't have been for people like Eve Ball and Percy Big Mouth and other individuals, we would never have had as many stories as we have written down today. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Lynda, can you hear me okay?
Uh-huh. And I really thank all of you, but one last thing, I thank all of you for signing up. And a big shout out to my colleagues and friends in Europe and in Australia, on the East and West Coast, and of course in our beloved Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico. I really appreciate all of you, and I thank you very much for listening.
Well, I want to thank you for giving this program. We do have some questions, and it must have been quite an honor to work with this lady. I have two questions, and then I will go into the chat and the Q&A and ask you a couple of questions as well. But one, do you have some idea, rough idea of how many people she ended up interviewing and getting involved with?
Well, she interviewed at least 70 of the old timers. That's a lot. You know, most people, when they do work on Apaches, they interview 4 or 5, maybe 10, and think it's a lot. But she lists the people that she interviewed in the back of in there. And I counted them one day, and there was something like 67 and there were others that she interviewed, but they were not necessarily included in that book. But that's quite a few tribal elders, and especially those who were survivors of the Apache Wars.
Okay, well, and thank you. And then how did the lady make a living, though? Did she do it through publishing and writing, or?
Well, you never make much money as a writer, I'll tell you that for sure. She was an educator. She got her master's degree in English, so she taught English.
Okay.
Remember, I mentioned those oil boom towns. Well, they needed teachers desperately, and so she was hired in Wink, Texas, Hobbs, New Mexico, Chama, New Mexico, and so that's part of how she made a living. And then when she moved to Redondo, she was no longer teaching, and she operated an antique store out of her house. And of course, she did make some money from writing, but in general, and then I guess she made some good investments because her brothers worked in the oil fields and eventually became part of the oil business. But she loved antiques and old things. And when you walked into her house, there were just books galore and all kinds of interesting things. It was like walking into a museum.
Well, I don't know if you've seen some of the thank yous, the kudos you've been getting online here, but one I just saw a moment ago was from Australia, I think.
Oh, that's my friend, yes.
And at 3 o'clock in the morning, they were watching this program, and so it certainly was well worth it to them, I'm sure. So here's a couple of questions, and I don't know if you can see those, but I will read them just in case. One question is, did Eve know any stories about the pictographs in Embrio Canyon? And this is from Marglyph.
Yeah, Marglyph. Hi, Marglyph. No, she didn't know. I don't think she knew about the battle at Embrio, but she never went there, and she never knew about any of the petroglyphs. No. Remember, she was in her 50s and 60s when she moved to Redondo. And so at that time, all that area was definitely closed, and they never spoke about those kinds of things. It was mainly about their lives as prisoners of war or prior to 1886. But that's a really good question. I would like to know more about those. They're wonderful petroglyphs there.
Now, where is Embrio Canyon located?
Embrio Canyon is near Las Cruces. It's in the mountain chain in that particular area. Maybe Marglyph can give a more specific pinpoint, but now it is on the White Sands Missile Range. So not just anybody can go. You have to have special permission to go.
Okay, thank you. Another question by Mark Severson. Do the cartridges that you picked up and showed the 3 have head stamps on the bottom by chance?
I think they do. I'm, not an expert on ammo, but I think they're 38 something or other by Remington. Now, pardon?
No, go ahead.
Well, no, that's all I know.
Well, that sort of answered Bill Cavalier's question, I think. It says, what caliber are Yanosha's cartridges? And he says they look like 4570s.
Mm-hmm.
Am I correct? And you may or may not know this.
Yeah, no, I don't think they're 4570s, but what I'll do, Bill, is I'll go in, I have a magnifying glass, and I'll check them out and I'll send you an email and let you know what they are. Gosh, it's so nice to hear all these people out there that are, I know who they are. That's wonderful.
There's a question here. It says from Judith Hoover. Any idea where in Texas that oil field was?
Oh, well, it was over in the Permian Basin. That's where she started her work. And Wink, Texas, I'm not sure exactly. I think Wink, Texas is also in that particular area. And then she moved to Hobbs and she worked in an oil chemical lab there for a while, but that wasn't her style. She wanted to be out of doors. She wanted to interview people and write history. So she got away from all that as quickly as she could.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question. It says from Veronica Ederer. It says, in the Geronimo Springs Museum, I saw a saddle from Ace Daklugie.
Daklugie.
Okay, I'll give it that to you. Do you know the story how Eve Ball got it?
Well, Ace gave her a lot of things, and so that was one of the things that he gave her. And actually, for many years, it was, along with other saddles, it was hanging out on her back porch, and it wasn't in very good condition. And eventually, she decided to ask museums if they wanted to have them, and the Geronimo Springs Museum got Daklugie's saddle.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, and by the way, Veronica is another Apache scholar. She's a young Apache scholar. She works in Zurich and is quite the writer. She's writing a biography of George Ratton, the interpreter. And another person, Bill Cavalieri, has a wonderful book out called A Concise History of the Chiricahua. So just lots of wonderful material out there.
I know that you're surrounded by old friends here for sure.
Yeah, that's really nice.
Here's a question from Paul Shemek, and I hope I didn't mess the names up on these, but it says, are you still friends with many of the Chiricahua families at Mescalero and the Fort Sill area?
At the time, you know, when I taught their children, I taught at Ruidoso for 15 years. And at that time, I was closer because parent-teacher conference, and they remembered me, the children, the students, and I went to some of their ceremonials, especially their puberty ceremonials. And at that time, I was much closer. At this point in time, I have been away for a long time, and every so often I do come across a family like in the store, and they come up and, oh, Miss Sánchez, and they give me a big hug and how are you? But I don't think a lot of them are not that interested in their history, or if they are, it's just a peripheral interest. I really would like to encourage more of them to write their stories, but so far it hasn't been too successful.
Okay, thank you. Pamela Watkins asks, do you feel that the Victoria Peak treasure was an impetus for the U.S. government to eliminate the Apache? That's question number one, and then I'll ask you the second one in a moment.
Okay, would you repeat that?
Do you feel that the Victoria Peak treasure was an impetus for the U.S. government to eliminate the Apache?
No, because it was at a totally different time. The treasure of Victoria Peak really got the interest of the military, like during World War II. I'm not an expert on the history of Victoria Peak, but a lot of that was legend and you know, the stories. And then when the military took over White Sands and closed it, they were not, the soldiers were not, the troopers were not out searching for Victorio's gold. It was our own military in the 40s and 50s. That's the rumor that, you know, they went into Victoria Peak. And one time when I was at Victoria Peak, they had a big piece of equipment. This is the grandson of Doc Noss, and it was called the Guzzler. It was like a big vacuum cleaner, and it was taking out the talus and all the chalk and the dirt. They were searching for Victoria's treasure at that time. But no, I don't think it was an impetus for their destruction.
So where is Victoria Peak roughly?
It's close to Embrio Canyon.
Okay.
I mean, from Embrio Canyon, you can see Victoria Peak. It's not very far from there.
Is it on the military?
It's not a very big peak. You know, whenever you think of a peak, you think of this big, tall mountain, but it's just kind of like a little nubbin.
Lynda, it's in the Oregon Mountains, isn't it?
It's what?
Is it in the Oregon Mountains, east of Las Cruces?
No. It's on the White Sands Missile Range on the other, the San Andreas, I believe.
Okay.
Then the second part to Pamela Watkins' question was, and have you ever heard of the Yancey Carlin involvement in the treasure's discovery?
The Yancey who?
Carlin, C-A-R-L-I-N, Carlin?
No, I'm not familiar with that.
Okay.
Treasure hunters here, huh?
Yeah, I guess. And Janice Donahue has asked, Lynda, did Eve ever tell of any of the caves in the area in relation to the Apaches?
Caves? No. Something that Eve never really got involved with those kinds of things. You know, we have Fort Stanton Cave, of course, here close to Lincoln. And we have Feather Cave, which is one of the most fascinating sites in the entire Southwest that was found by cavers. And Apaches consider those two caves as very sacred. But Eve was more involved with the history rather than the anthropology and the archaeology. I'm kind of like both, you know, hand in glove, as I said, or you said in your introduction.
Well, since you mentioned the Fort Stanton Cave, do you want to give a brief mention of the book?
Oh, the 12 Miles from Daylight?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's another book out. I'm a co-author of that. It's called 12 Miles from Daylight. I don't have it with me right now, but it is a beautiful all color book about the history of Fort Stanton Cave from the time of the Native American history all through the cavalry and the public health service, and how it was explored by these individuals. And then now, of course, it is surrounded by Bureau of Land Management property, and the Bureau of Land Management actually is the caretaker of that cave. It's pretty interesting, the story of counterfeiting and all kinds of things, but there's not much information about Apaches and at Fort Stanton Cave, but there is a lot of interest in the Feather Cave. But that was the Jornada Magillon people who created ceremonial chambers, and that's just across the river. But the book was written by cavers, and then I was on their board for 10 years of the Fort Stanton Cave Study Project, and we decided, in fact, I bugged these guys that have been caving for 50 years. I said, you guys need to leave behind a legacy and you need to write a book about this. And they said, all right, you write the history of the area and we'll write the cave history. So that was our bargain, and it's a beautiful book.
Okay, I just had a question flash up, see if I can repeat this. Have you ever been to Ojo Caliente?
Yes.
Victoria's homeland?
Yes.
Explain that a little bit.
Ojo Caliente. Was there another part of the question?
Well, no, not really. Just about it, I think.
Well, Ojo Caliente, I can see why they loved it there and why they resented it when they were sent to San Carlos. but it is over that, all that country is wonderful. And the Apaches certainly selected great land for their homeland instead of San Carlos and some of the other places they were sent. And the hot springs there at Ojo Caliente are beautiful. And I remember there was an Apache conference in 1990 or something like that over at TRC. And we went on field trips to what the ruins were of the agency there at Ojo Caliente. And then I've been up that entire arroyo and canyon, and it's just heaven. It's beautiful.
I've had two people ask, one was Paul and one was Kenley, about the book that I keep bugging you about.
No, I'm not going to answer.
Well, about the Bronco Apaches in Mexico.
They want to know what, when I'm going to.
They want to know when you're going to get it done.
Well, you know, guys, I've been working on this book for 40 years. That's a long time. And I have so much material now that I have decided to divide it into two books. The first book is going to be on the Chiricahua Apache, the Nedni, and the individuals that did not surrender. You know, there were a lot of Apaches that did not come in, that did not surrender, and they ended up in the Sierra Madre, and they continued raiding in Mexico and the United States up until the 1930s. It's a fascinating story, as you know, obviously, Butch. So that's the first book. And that's the book where I went into the Sierra Madre and interviewed a lot of the families and had quite an adventure. And Eve was still alive at that time. And she was so excited about another project. And of course, she died in 1984. And that was the end. And I got a job teaching at that time. So everything had to be put on the back burner for quite a while, including the Percy Big Mouth manuscript. The second book is going to be on the Cuban Apache story and the Lipan story. I call it the Lost Apaches. I don't call it the Bronco Apaches, the Lost Apaches, because there were many different groups of Apaches that were, I consider, lost. Not lost that they didn't know where they were, but their history is lost. And it just kind of disappeared at the end of the Apache Wars in 1886. The military said the wars are over, the campaigns are over, there's no more problem. But that wasn't the case, as you know. They continued raiding for many, many years. And General Scott, in his memoirs, wrote about a mission that he wanted Yanosha and Tuclani and Naiche to go on into the Sierra Madre to bring back their people. And this was in 1895 at Fort Sill, and he proposed that those guys go down and help him bring back the Apaches to the reservation. And they planned it all out, and it was a go. And then the Mexican consulate sent a message to our people in Washington and said, no, we don't want them down here. You just stay away, don't cross the border. And if they had been successful, just imagine all of those deaths and problems, and then the families would have been united too. So all of that is going to be included, and that's all relatively new information that I've gotten in the last 10 or 15 years. So I'm hoping that before I'm 100, I will have it out. I promise you.
I mean, I'm going to be around to keep you to your promise, I hope, at least, anyway.
Well, you're mean enough, you will.
Well, I don't know. And that's one last question, I think, which is from Frank, and it says, did the Mescaleros avail themselves of modern medicine, and were there medical facilities on the reservation?
During what time frame? The agency the Mescalero agency was at first here at Fort Stanton, and the Fort Stanton, being a military base, always had, doctors available. Then it was moved over to Mescalero, where it has been now for many, many years. And they have a hospital there now at Mescalero, and they've always had medical facilities, but I would say the Apaches use both. They use both the modern medicine, and then they use their own medicine, and they don't often talk about those things. They keep that pretty much secret.
Well, and there's another question here real quick. It's from Janice, and she says, and it's really a statement, I think. Feather Cave is named for the feathers in the ceiling, which would have been impossible for any man to get to. They were so high up. Do you have any comment about that?
Well, there were Feather Cave was an amazing discovery, and there were 2 chambers, and there were not only feathers like pajos, prayer sticks, and many feathers in the cave. Stuck in the ceiling, there were sandals, miniature sandals. There were miniature arrows and darts and bows. I mean, it was a treasure trove of discovery. They also had charcoal drawings and they had handprints on the wall. I mean, it was an amazing discovery.
And where is it located?
It's located about a mile across the river from Fort Stanton Cave, but it's closed. It is totally closed. Histoplasmosis was discovered there, and unless you go in with a respirator, you don't want to go in without a respirator, and the BLM hasn't closed.
Okay. Well,
Butch, there's a couple of questions in the chat. Do you want me to get those?
well, yeah, would you go ahead now and do that?
Okay, they're kind of scattered in the chat here.
No, that's the reason, yeah.
Okay, one from Steve Lexman says, did Eve hear stories about Florida or Mobile? Those were traumatic times. And he says, great talk, very much enjoyed it. Leadfoot Lynda.
And what, Lynda?
Leadfoot Lynda.
Oh, Leadfoot Lynda, yes. I guess I shouldn't have admitted that.
So did she ever talk about Florida or Mobile relative to the Apaches?
Did she talk about what? You're kind of garbled.
Florida or Mobile?
Oh, you mean Alabama?
Yeah.
Yeah, part of the book is about their prisoner of war years in Florida and also in Alabama. And mostly they stayed, of course, at Fort Sill, and it was a godsend when they ended up in Fort Sill compared to the hellhole of Mount Vernon Barracks and the 2 places they stayed in Florida. She really discussed a lot of that. You know, Eve has just much material, and it was hard to synthesize it down into 1 or 2 books. Her papers now are in, Brigham Young has most of her papers, although some papers are in UTEP and also at Rio Grande Collections out of New Mexico State.
Yeah, that was the only other question I saw in the chat.
There are quite a few thank yous and well dones in this chat and question and answer section, Lynda. I don't know how easy it is for you to take a look at those, but there are.
I will send her the whole file for it.
Oh, well,
Okay.
that would be great, because it's always nice to hear good things. And, you know, if any of you have, you listening to this evening, if you have specific questions, I don't mind if Al gives you my email. I'll be glad to respond and help you if I can.
Let me put that in the chat right now so people can copy it before you sign off. Hang on.
Okay. It's Dime. You have it, right?
I do.
Okay.
Well, Lynda or Leadfoot, whichever you would like to known by.
Well, at least you didn't call me Bigfoot.
I almost did, but you've gone from that to maggots and quite a coverage. But mostly, I think it was an honor for you to have known Eve Ball, and it certainly was a great pleasure for us to have you talk about her and to answer some of these other questions as well. So just, I think on behalf of Old Pueblo Archaeology Center and the Third Thursday Food for Thought program tonight, very much like to just thank you. And I guess that's it, Alan. Is there anything else I should be saying, or you want to talk about?
Well, we could ask people again to make donations for
Oh,
our
I'm sorry. Yes.
education program.
Yeah. Pass that hat logo thing around again. Yeah.
Well, you all are wonderful, and I thank you. And one of these days, I'm going to drop in and visit you all in Tucson, because those are my old stomping grounds too.
Sounds good.
Bye-bye.
We look forward to
Lynda.
it. Thanks, Lynda.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Night.
Bye-bye.